Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming out on this balmy Wednesday evening. I'm sure you'd rather be at Washington Square Park in the fountain, but thank you for coming out. We really appreciate it. My name is Gianpaolo Baiocchi. I am the director of the Urban Democracy Lab, which is an initiative here at the Gallatin School of Individualized Studies. And we have some quite prominent guests with us tonight to discuss what we think is a very, very important issue. I've lived in New York for about a year, and I would say 10% of the emails I get from abroad have to do with some version of the question of what is up with Bill de Blasio. Is it as progressive as we're told? I actually got a recent email from a person who was a staffer in the city administration of Porto Alegre, which, as some of you know, for a long time was considered a kind of bastion of leftist municipal politics. So we thought we would do this event and invite you to come talk with us about it, and we found some interesting people to comment. We are asking, the question tonight is, how progressive has Bill de Blasio's administration been? We're asking about urban ecology and land use, the arts, economic equity, policing, and citizenship. Of course, as I'm sure the conversation goes on, what progressive means is itself an issue worth talking about. About us, the Urban Democracy Lab, we're a new initiative here at NYU. We promote critical, creative, just, and sustainable forms of urbanism, and we would like to underline just. We promote scholarship, curricular activities, public events, and engagement, like tonight's evening. We're especially interested in new forms of urban democracy, whether in governance, in activism, in forms of self-management, or even in forms of creative production. Our aim, as with tonight's event, is to give context to the issues that most affect us as city dwellers. We would like to thank a couple of people. First of all, we'd like to thank the NYU Gallatin School of Individualized Studies. Some of you no doubt know Gallatin School is a small liberal arts school within NYU. It is a school without majors where we practice interdisciplinary and individualized education. Gallatin encourages its students and faculty to engage with the world outside the classroom and bring current scholarship to bear on the most pressing questions we face today. This event, like the other one sponsored by the Urban Democracy Lab, benefits from the support of the Gallatin community and especially its dean, Suzanne Wofford. We've also relied tremendously on some of our partners here at NYU, like the Institute for Public Knowledge, Teatro Mundi, and some of our community-based partners, like the City as Living Laboratory. I suppose it just occurred to me, Gallatin is like the Uruguay of NYU. We are small, but very progressive, and all kinds of interesting things going on. So look it up about Uruguay, it's true. And finally, this is our kickoff event of the Urban Democracy Lab this year. There will be, if you are SVP'd, we have your email. We will chase you down. There will be a chance for you to put your name down for further events. We have a number of interesting things going on this year, including about urban infrastructure, some reflections on Occupy, among other events. Finally, our website launches. It's urbandemos.nyu.edu. And a couple of thank yous before I introduce our panel. So first of all, thank you to Becky Amato, our assistant director, for the vision for tonight's event. Victor, the videographer. Daniel Cohen for some crucial contacts at the last minute. Asher Novak, chief technological innovator of the Urban Democracy Lab, and our designer, Fran Pollitt, and our producer, Lisa Mackey. Okay, our panel. And I'll introduce people in the order they're speaking tonight. So Jarrett Murphy, at the far end, he's executive director and publisher of citylimits.org. Citylimits.org is a 38-year-old nonprofit news agency covering urban affairs in New York City. He's been there since 2007, and before that, he was investigations editor and the editor-in-chief. He's a graduate of Fordham University, and he's also worked at the Hartford Advocate, CBSNews.com, and the Village Voice. He lives in Norwood section of Bronx, and we're talking about urban ecology and land use. After that, Sakshi Kanafo, who covers jails, drugs, and other subjects for Huffington Post. He has written for the New York Times Magazine, New York Magazine, Believer, GQ, and Detail. His work appears in a number of anthologies, among which Lost and Found Stories from New York Stories, and Unscrolled, 54 Artists and Writers Wrestle with the Torah. He's it was important that we say that he's actually from Brooklyn. Before every writer in America was contractually obligated to live there. And he will be talking about policing and framing it as an issue of economic equity. After him, Karen Atlas is director of Arts and Democracy, which supports the cross-fertilization of culture, participatory democracy, and social justice. She directs the Natural Occurring Cultural Districts Working Group of New York. She teaches at Pratt's Program of Sustainable Planning and Development. She's the co-editor of Bridge Conversations and Critical Perspectives and a contributor to Beyond Zuccotti Park, toward a 21st Century City for All and a cultural blueprint for New York City. And close to my heart, of course, she's a district and steering committee for the PB New York City and has also been engaged in the relief and recovery work following Hurricane Sandy. And she'll be talking about arts in the city. After that, Claudio Ivan Mereira, who's the Metro editor for El Diario, La Prensa, editor of Hispanic New York, which is a book from Columbia University Press. He's the winner of the 2011 International Latino Book Award in the category of Best Reference Book in English. His work has appeared in the Huffington Post, NBC Latino, Hora Hispana, El Nuevo Día, El País, which is Spanish, and La Nación and Página 12 from Argentina, among other publications. He'll be talking about de Blasio's position on immigration and citizenship, and he's warned he's going to go off topic a little bit. That's fine. And finally, we are very fortunate to have Mary Rowe moderate tonight's panel. She's currently the director of Urban Resilience and Livability at Municipal Art Society, the MAS of New York City. She directs the resilience work there, including convening community engagement to build local resilience building strategies and support of the National Rebuild by Design, which is partially housed here at NYU at IPK. She's also part of the MAS City Builders Global Network, a peer-to-peer learning platform connecting urban practitioners committing to the livability and resilience of cities around the world. Previously, she spent 5 years learning about granular approaches to urban innovation while supporting the New Orleans Institute for Resilience and Innovation, which was a loose alliance of initiatives that emerged in response to the systemic collapses of 2005 in the wake of Katrina. Originally from Toronto, she has a particular interest in self-organization in cities as underpinning the urban, social, economic, cultural, and environmental resilience. And she's a contributor to several volumes on urban life. Well, thank you, everyone, and we look forward to your talks.
The way we're going to do this is each of the presenters is going to say a few words of varying lengths. So if you're, to heck with that, if you're anxious about how long they're going, just know that we have an able timekeeper here in the front who's going to make sure they don't go over. They'll each have a few words to say, then we'll have some discussion amongst us, and then we're going to come out to you. For those of you who are literate in social media, we're going to tweet like crazy, and we think we're going to use the hashtag de Blasio Progressive. It's a rather long hashtag. I've been advised you're not allowed to put punctuation in there, so I didn't know whether it could be de Blasio Progressive ? Or de Blasio Progressive ! But apparently you can't put punctuation. Who's an expert tweeter? Can you? You can't. No punctuation. Okay, so de Blasio Progressive is what, no, on a hashtag. All right, so just start tweeting it like crazy. They'll keep track of it. Are we taping this? Is this why these lovely lights are here, making us all look beautiful? Okay, then. So bear with us as we squint away, but apparently we're going to tape it, and it's over to you. Jared, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for coming. City Limits is a progressive publication, so that means that in our hearts we agree with just about everything Bill de Blasio stands for, and in our heads we are skeptical of everything he does. We also were founded, so that puts me, I think, in a good position to be here. We were founded in the 1970s in the fiscal crisis mainly as a housing publication, and that's still at the heart of what we focus on in terms of the policies we cover and the problems we investigate. So what I'm talking about tonight, urban ecology, is very much near and dear to sort of our institutional heart. What does urban ecology mean? I was thinking about this earlier today, trying to figure out what I was going to say tonight. And to me, it ties into what is my go-to recommendation for friends who are visiting the city, which is, and I don't know if anybody here has not been there, but it's to take the 7 train out to the Queens Museum of Art and see the panorama of New York City, which is by far the most stunning way you can spend a couple hours. It's if you haven't been there, it is a movie theater size room with a scale model of the city showing every single structure. You can even find my modest little Bronx row house there. You can find this building. And you walk around it on this glass-bottomed walkway. And it's truly stunning. And even if you've been a student of the city for most of your adult life, which is the case for me, and if you've been all over the city since you were a teenager, which is true for, I'm sure, many of us, you really get a sense there of a few things. The city's vastness, The diversity of uses, the fact that it stretches from, the fishing communities of City Island to the dense office districts of Manhattan, from, mansions in Douglaston to, public housing concentrations in Brownsville. You get a sense of how the infrastructure stitches together what is really just a chain of islands. It seems to us like a pretty seamless thing sometimes, but you really get a sense in that 3D environment of how all that pulls it together. And you see also how the man-made or human-made world interacts with the natural one, which we often don't realize. We have a vast city of 8 million people, 323 square miles of land, surrounded by water with salt marshes and beaches and forests in the interior. So you really get a sense of how all that comes together to be the city. And what you realize is that among the things we'll be talking about tonight in terms of all the impacts a mayor can have on how the city operates, its character, who's going to be welcome to live there, its culture, the mayor's shaping of the physical city is a critical part of his or her job for a couple obvious reasons. One is that land is the ultimate, non-renewable finite resource, right? I mean, you can build up, which we do in New York, and you can, take the stuff you dig out to build up and fill in and create land like in Battery Park City. But there is a limit to how much you can create land. There's only so much of it. And that's true everywhere. But in New York City, the intensity of competition for resources is so great that it really makes the political challenge of managing land that much greater. It also means, the physical city means, that this aspect of the mayor's legacy has a certain permanence to it, that others don't. We'll long think about the echo of Mayor Bloomberg's stop and frisk and the testing in the schools and the whatever else, but that could go away and be a thing of memory. It's going to be a long time before the buildings that we see along the Brooklyn waterfront ever go away, whether they should or shouldn't. So those are true for every mayor. I think for a progressive mayor, the land use ecology questions are even more interesting because of that competition for resources. Mayor de Blasio was not elected on a tide of progressive hope. He was elected on a tide of progressive hopes. A lot of different groups that had shared a sense that we needed change in the city, but had very different ideas of what that change should look like. You have people who want affordable housing, and you have folks who would emphasize industrial development. You have folks who are interested in, environmental sustainability, and others who want to see, job-creating infrastructure projects that may or may not tie in with that. So he has to square all of that. He also has to figure out a process that is itself progressive, because as anybody who's been to a community board meeting or been through a land use discussion in New York City knows, it's not just about the end product, it's about the process to get there. Is there a progressive way to do infrastructure land use planning in the city and still get a progressive outcome? That's, I think, a very real question. In addition, Mayor Bloomberg is the first mayor to really have to deal with these issues, with climate change being a known and present danger. It's hard to realize that, at the beginning of Mayor Bloomberg's time in office, we knew this was happening. We knew it was going to happen someday. But it really wasn't until Sandy occurred that folks, I think, grasped just how present the threat is. And so, since we're an island, city of islands, that threat from the sea is a very big part of land use decisions. And also, Mayor Bloomberg, as a political animal, which all politicians are, comes from a background having a lot of support in organized labor, and also having good relations with the development community, two spheres of the city who have a very particular ideas and needs about land use, which will color, I think, how his actions are perceived. So how is he doing so far? And there's a lot we could talk about, a lot more than I have time to say. You could talk about the policies on homelessness, which is a land use issue to some degree, on NYCHA, on manufacturing support. And we can talk about that as the evening goes on Sandy rebuilding, I think, we can have a whole conference on that. Let me focus on just two areas that I think are probably the most critical. One is the question about environmental sustainability. De Blasio has gotten a reputation for having neglected that issue to this point. And I think that reputation is unfair. The mayor actually has done a bit on environmental sustainability. He has updated the city's pollution control code, or he's attempted to. The council's having hearings on that now. He's expanded a carbon challenge program. He's done stuff with low-flow toilets. He's done stuff with the Blue Belt, solar power. He's introduced some new building efficiency codes. I'm told that there'll be some big announcement coming during Climate Week later in the month. I'm not sure exactly what that is. And so I think compared certainly to the first 6 months of the Bloomberg administration, and remember Plan YC didn't come until I think early 2007, he's done pretty well. It's true that he has not introduced a new head of the Office of Long-Term Sustainability and Long-Term Planning and Sustainability, and that's a problem. He also has not done a major speech on environmental issues, and people often jump on that too. And I think that creates a problem of perception because people in the media, like me, we have to reduce the incredible complexity of a mayor's time in office to some easily understandable themes. And so the theme now is that de Blasio is about inequality and housing, and that the environmental stuff is being pushed aside. I don't think that's quite true, but the fact that he has not emphasized what he's done to this point, I think lends itself to that interpretation. City Hall is very sensitive, I think, about that claim, and I think you'll be seeing in coming weeks and months an effort to rebut it. But affordable housing is clearly the big kahuna. It obviously affects all the other land use issues. As someone was telling me in February during the fight over UPK is nothing compared to trying to create 200,000 units of affordable housing or preserve 200,000 units of affordable housing over 10 years. The mayor's plan that came out in, I think that was late April, is remarkably detailed, and it is a map for where he wants to go, but it's not an itinerary. Now, what's the difference? The mayor has made clear in that plan that he wants a denser, more equitable city, and he's laid out a number of ways that the city's going to get there. From talking about land banks to cleaning up brownfields to adjusting how tax credits are used. Dozens and dozens of policy tweaks to gain or preserve a few units here or there. But the big issue, obviously, is going to be trying to get some bulk in the production of this housing, and that is where the mandatory inclusionary zoning policy will come in, and the question of trying to create more density in at least 15 different city neighborhoods. Now, as we know from past battles, density is not always a popular thing, and exactly how that's going to look neighborhood to neighborhood, the mayor's plan is very quiet on. And I think that in part reflects that they want to have a grassroots, a ground-up process where they go to a neighborhood and say, we want to encourage some more density here. What other infrastructure can we bring in to make that make sense? I honestly think that's what they're trying to do. But having that process and having that approach means there is no plan now that we can say, okay, this is how it's going to look. Like we could at the beginning of the Bloomberg plan. And so I think that means that, a lot of this discussion really can't be had until a few years from now when we see what the affordable housing plan looks like, where it goes, how much density they achieve, and what those political battles look like. And so I'll close on this note, which is that from the outset of the administration, given the promises that de Blasio made, some of us have asked questions about how his impact on inequality could be measured, because inequality can be kind of a nebulous thing to pin down. And I think on the housing issues, it's not just a question of how we'll measure it, but when. And at what point we'll be able to say whether or not the plan was successful in achieving the kind of city, the denser, more equitable place that de Blasio has talked about. Because remember, the last big plan before Bloomberg's was the Koch 10-year plan, and that really didn't get built out until I think the end of the Dinkins and maybe early Giuliani administration. So it'll be a while before we'll be able to say, with any definition, exactly how the de Blasio approach to urban ecology, whether it's sustainability or affordable housing or any of the myriad other things that are in the panorama in Queens, how that all looks like. But I think that's the picture so far. Thank you.
If any of you took the 4 or 5 train to get here, you may have seen Danny Siciliano turning somersaults in the air while clinging to a pair of handlebars. Maybe you admired the virtuosity of his feet or worried about the lack of space between his sneakers and your face, or shrugged at the familiar spectacle of a hustle you've seen performed 100 times. The business of executing acrobatic tricks on a subway car hurtling through space has been around for a long time, and it's long had a polarizing effect on riders. But the ranks of supporters are thick enough that Danny, by his account, earns enough money from his performances to support his 3 children. According to him, he doesn't have many other options. He says the only other work available to someone of his skills and educational level is day labor, which pays about $80 a day, or $20 less than what he can make on the subway in half as many hours. When I asked what he'd most like to do for a living, he told me that he'd really like to work as a janitor. Danny's been at this for a decade, long enough to remember when the police generally left the dancers alone, but that changed about a year ago, he said, around the same time that a former transit cop named Bill Braden returned to One Police Plaza for his second stint at the helm of America's largest police force. Back in the 90s, Braden rose to the top post in the NYPD on the strength of his reputation as the head of a transit force that cracked down on fare beaters and garnered accolades for cleaning up the subways. A few months into his encore turn this year, he proudly announced that arrests of the subway acrobats were up by 300%. Danny has been arrested 7 times in the last year, he told me, and each arrest has led to about 3 days in jail. As he put it, that's 3 days that he's not making money for his family. The question of whether it's appropriate and effective to arrest and jail young men for earning their living at something that perhaps bothers a certain percentage of subway passengers is at the center of a larger debate playing out in de Blasio's New York, and a debate that's embodied by the opposing forces within his own administration. De Blasio came to power in part by vowing to improve the dynamics between the city's police and its low-income communities of color. He pledged to end the racially biased deployment of stop and frisk, the aggressive tactic of patting down anyone suspected of carrying drugs or guns. His mixed-race teenage son took on the issue in a campaign spot that went viral. And yet his first significant act as mayor was to choose as his police commissioner Braden, a man who has done more than perhaps anyone else in the world to promote quality of life, or broken windows policing, as it's sometimes called. I apologize if I'm saying what you already know, but the theory of broken windows holds that if minor crimes are allowed to go unpunished, it will create the perception that authorities have no control, that they've surrendered control over a neighborhood, emboldening serious criminals to commit serious crimes. There's little evidence to support the theory, and it's been well established that blacks and Latinos are disproportionately arrested for these minor crimes. But in the first 5 months of de Blasio's tenure, the police have arrested more people for minor infractions than they did in the first 5 months of Bloomberg's last year in office. When the group Police Reform Organizing Project conducted a survey of New York courts this spring, they found that nearly 90% of the hundreds of defendants charged with low-level offenses were people of color. The tactic remains hugely popular in New York, with some 60% of New Yorkers saying in a recent poll that they support it. And even the most progressive voices in the city council have largely remained silent on the issue. In the wake of Eric Garner's death this summer, at the hands of police who had been attempting to arrest him for selling untaxed cigarettes, de Blasio stood by Braden in supporting the use of police to respond to these quality of life offenses. I can understand why any New Yorker may say that's not such a big offense, he said at a press conference, but a violation of the law is a violation of the law. He explained that he'd been critical of stop and frisk not because there was something inherently wrong with the tactic, but because the police used it as a pretext for conducting unconstitutional searches of people who attracted suspicion simply because of the color of their skin and their style of dress. The nuance of this distinction didn't seem to impress some of his sometimes supporters, like the NYCLU, who are demanding wholesale reforms. of broken windows policing. There are some simple things that the mayor could do to scale back quality of life policing. He could replace arrests with tickets and fines. He could order, say, the Department of Finance to take over from the NYPD when it comes to penalizing people for things like untaxed cigarettes. But with Braden at his side, it seems unlikely that he'll make that call. The conventional wisdom is that he brought in Braden to protect his right flank, to guard against the perception of him as a liberal, as a soft on crime liberal. If he were to tussle with a commissioner over something as popular as quality of life policing, he could perhaps jeopardize the other items on his progressive agenda, like universal pre-K and affordable housing. De Blasio has already taken some progressive steps in the realm of criminal justice. He hired the reformer Joseph Ponti to take over Rikers Island, and he approved a $12 million investment in a neighborhood anti-violence initiative centered on social services, an effort that Bloomberg had never supported. Even Braden impressed some progressives when he ordered a full retraining of the NYPD on the use of force after Garner's death. But for now, it seems unlikely that the mayor will take any steps to remove arrest and jail from the equation when it comes to addressing things like the sale of loose cigarettes or dancing in the subway.
Can you all see me? I'm a little short here. Well, I am just excited for our discussion. But I'm going to say a little bit about arts as part of a progressive agenda, arts and culture. So as in my introduction, I direct Arts and Democracy, which is about participatory democracy, arts and culture, social justice, and Naturally Occurring Cultural Districts New York, which is really about engaging the power of indigenous culture in communities as a powerful force for civic engagement and equitable development. So right from the start, when the transition came along, we were very eager to be at the table to have our voice be heard about arts and culture. We wanted to frame it because so often arts and culture gets framed outside of the progressive framework, or it's often a discussion about we need more money for the arts for our organizations, and it becomes very self-focused. So we were eager early on to say arts and culture for a just and equitable city, and we wrote a brief called that. Now, that's not an easy thing to do. I bet a bunch of you are sitting here saying, yeah, right. Because this kind of notion of arts and culture being elitist is very deeply rooted in some of folks. And I know this from working in neighborhoods that, you know, even though people engage in culture every day, they may feel when you say arts, it's that cultural institution over there that has nothing to do with my life. Another, example is that I was part of the 21st Century City for All group that had a series of roundtables to create a book and a progressive agenda for New York to influence the transition. And my first day there at one of the roundtables, somebody said to me, which issue are you with? And I said, arts and culture. And they said, oh, wow, you have a hard time since arts and culture is the thing that's causing all the gentrification in the city. So, and then we have the challenge of our own arts community. When we wrote this brief, Arts and Culture for a Just and Equitable City, one of the things we called for was cultural equity. And that freaked some people out. I started getting calls from people who would never talk to me before, thinking that somehow we were trying to take their money away from them. And, my response was sort of, guys, we're in an equity moment. At least you got to pretend to care about equity. But cultural equity is a very charged phrase for some folks in our sector. So the other side of it is we put this brief out. We wanted to get it to the transition teams before they met. We had one weekend, basically, to get it together and get signatures. And we got 100 signatures from people of all different kinds of progressive groups in one weekend. So I don't want to overemphasize, there's also lots of support for this idea. Our set of values, besides the idea that arts and culture is in really embedded in progressive agendas and in our communities, I would say some of the other values of our work is the recognition of art and culture being broadly defined. So we're talking about culture very broadly, including the dancers in the subways. And it's what's really important to us is that people have a say in the decision making that impacts their lives. And that, I guess underlying it all is a really deep respect for the wisdom of people in communities and their ability to say what they need and determine for themselves what change is needed. So it makes it a little hard for me to talk about Bill de Blasio, because for me, it's a question of what's a progressive city, not what's a progressive mayor, and what can create the conditions by which people can self-determine change and gain the agency they need and the ability they need to make it, and to add arts and culture to that, to be able to express their creativity in a way that can make change. So as for the mayor, I can say a couple things. There was a concern from the arts community that his agenda didn't really include arts and culture. He had a little bit about arts education. And there was a concern that he didn't name a cultural commissioner for a long time. A lot of that kind of died down because he picked a really good commissioner, Tom Finkelpearl, who was the former director of the Queens Museum of Art, and whose he kind of is the guy that can speak to everybody, because he is very much a populist around arts and culture, but he ran a large institution. But his manner and his way of working is being very open, and that's something that a lot of us hadn't experienced before. The other thing that really came across that we're really happy about is that in the past administration, there was a lot of attention to tourism and economic development from top down related to arts and culture, and not much talk about neighborhoods or about the social impact of the arts. And this really was made very clear. We were delighted to hear Mayor de Blasio at the announcement of Tom Finkelpearl talk about how he thinks that you can't have a flourishing democracy without a strong cultural sector, without the ability of artists of all kinds to express themselves, to challenge us, to make us think, to provoke us. So we heard that, and we heard what he and the commissioner said around the social impact of the arts and the importance of integrating the arts and other agencies and other activities in the city, and felt encouraged by that. I would say the things, I have to say, you get really excited at these announcements and everybody's hugging and kissing each other and being very happy, and then, reality hits and bureaucracies take long times to change. And, what actually can change? I mean, I think in the cultural sector, this is why a lot of people don't work with the government, because they can see change happening quicker, or in a way they could better see, put their hands around it, either on a community level or in a movement building way. Some of the things that have happened is $23 million was spent on arts education. That's a good thing. I mean, it's good to have that. And it was the mayor, but it was really also the comptroller, Scott Stringer, who put out a report saying there's inequity in opportunities for arts education for our kids. And this was a response to that. I would say other good things that happen is that good things for New Yorkers are good things for artists. They're New Yorkers. So if there's more affordable housing, that's going to be a good thing. If there's pre-K for their kids, artists have kids. And if you can get sick days, that's a good thing too. The ID card issue is interesting because the arts community was brought into that by the commissioner asking the large institutions in the city to give a bonus, some kind of membership bonus. I think they're still working out what the benefit is if people have the city ID card, to make everybody want to get the card because you get to go to the museum. I think that's great, and I think it's great to ask the city institutions that get a lot of money from the city to step up and be good citizens that way. I also think that there should be a recognition for the neighborhood groups that have been working, that's part of our mission, to work with immigrant communities and be allies on this, and that there should be a recognition of that work as well. Okay. So the last, on the police issues, I'll say that's really interesting. I just want to sort of work off of what you said. We're developing a number of different sets of policy recommendations, and one of the ones our group is really excited about is called Culture is Not a Crime. And we're really, I mean, do folks know 5 Points, that area where that was painted? That was, an amazing place where people painted, and it was non-sanctioned. There's a lot of art that happens in this city that's not sanctioned. What can we do to not criminalize it? What can we do to actually celebrate it? And to take that one step further around the work we're doing around space, why do we have to spend so much time getting access to do things in parks or into our public civic spaces? How can we work with the city to create opportunities to truly have civic spaces that creativity can flourish in, and you don't have to spend days and days and days trying to get permitted or being thrown out? So I need to wrap it up. I think the last thing I'll just put out there is that the topic of civic engagement, and maybe I'll just say we can talk about that in the discussion, because I wanted to talk about what our recommendations would be for the city really embracing the idea of the role of artists in civic engagement when things happen like Sandy, or when things happen like a young man is shot and killed in Ferguson. Artists are there. They're very engaged, and they're very much part of coming together and dealing with hard issues. How can we really promote that idea and not be afraid of what happens, but actually see that as a real asset for the city?
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for, it's okay, yeah, for the invitation. First of all, I want to say that I was not supposed to be here tonight, because the invite was originally for my colleague Marlene Peralta, who couldn't make it today, so she asked me to take her place, and so I want to also thank her. As you might know, as was said in the introductions, I'm the Metro editor for El Diario, which is the longest standing Spanish language newspaper in the country. And while listening to the previous speakers, so exciting and thought-provoking comments, I couldn't help by wondering what is exactly the issues for our readership, the readership from El Diario's readership, which is now, as a journalist for the past almost a year, I'm training myself to think about the city from the perspective of our readers, and so I was wondering how I could define the progressiveness of the Blasio from the perspective of our particular constituency, which are working class immigrants mostly. I mean, the basic, our basic audience is made up of the newly arrived immigrants, and the older ones who still read in Spanish, but our most thriving audience is the newly arrived. And although El Diario and most of our readers are, we are committed to a progressive agenda. It's part of a traditional mission of El Diario. When you look, and almost every day we are surprised to see the reactions of our readers through all the measurements that we have today through social media. It's almost immediate that we can know through their comments in Facebook or the comments on the stories, etc., on our website, what is exactly what the kind of things that that working class immigrants are really interested in. And many times we are surprised, and I will finish these initial remarks with the issue that I think strikes me the most, and which is the big elephant in the room of progressiveness in the country. So just to touch directly on the point that I was asked to develop tonight, which is immigration and citizenship, there is no doubt that the most important measure that de Blasio has undertaken in this regard has been the municipal ID, fulfilling the promise that he made in the campaign. What can also be said about that, and it's a particular concern that I have about this administration, is as you can see also these days with the launching of the pre-K, there is an eagerness of the administration to do those things that they can do, right? Or at least it seems easier to do and to produce a result than in other questions. So there was a real, effectiveness in getting out the measurement and in enlisting, the support of all the. Of course, we have the most progressive city hall, I think, at least in my known history of the country. I don't know if more than 20 years ago it was any more progressive caucus than the one we have now. What you can say also is that my concern is in as to what degree is really this administration in the small details of implementation of things, right? So municipal IDs still, we don't know yet, not even how it's going to work, where you can get all this procedure, but what part of the administration is going to run that thing, right? So that is a criticism that I think, if you watch the administration, the reaction of the administration to this first storms right after the mayor took office, etc., to this to the pre-K questions, I think that there is a serious question there as to maybe the administration is trying to rush into things with good reasons, but I think that this is still some fine-tuning there that is important to do. Just if not for other things, just to avoid the image of the well-intended but inefficient progressive, right? I think that's very important to keep that in track. There is another thing that, if you're not following very closely the issues that concerns, working class immigrants and other working class the population living in welfare, is that this administration has introduced a number of very specific, measures that help bring in more welfare aid to undocumented immigrants and, through coupons, etc. This is very important since, as you know, undocumented immigrants are not covered by many of, Obamacare, for instance, they are away from that. So, and the money that funds these programs is federal money. So it's not that much that the local administration can do. And to his credit, de Blasio has done a great job in that. I mean, trying to do whatever they can do. The same with affordable housing, with all the different programs that have been defunded in Congress. So, I think it's very important when we assess the results of this administration on a number of issues that has to do with funds that are decided in Congress in Washington, that we're really dealing with very difficult times, and just trying to make whatever they can do is even more commendable. Now, I think that the most important thing to me, at least at this point, and I think that most of us can agree on this, that the defining issue of the de Blasio administration so far is broken windows. I mean, the acid test to all these things, and it's been wonderfully put by all of you before me. It's a political balancing act, as the one he performed today, supporting Cuomo and Hochul for the gubernatorial primary, and of course this is politics, and even a progressive has to do politics if he wants to stay in the game. And so, but the thing is, in my view, that the way this discussion is finally going to impact the polls is showcasing or highlighting the racial divide that exists in the country and in the city. I think it was a report I read about 10 years ago in City Limits about how segregated the city is, the residential segregation of New York. And I was surprised. I was just beginning to live in New York, and I was surprised to see the data that was telling me that my experience of integration and friendliness and racial, wasn't supported by the strong and the strong data of how and when and where people actually lives, right? And so when I started knowing the city better and living more here, I understood the reality of that. And when you look at the polls, the reaction, for instance, towards the death of Gardner, the real divide is the racial divide. And we see how many people are in favor. 60% or more, I think, of white New Yorkers don't think that there should be presented any criminal charges towards the policeman that provoked the death of Gardner. Just looking at those, the polls that came out last week, I think that's the real deepest story of the two cities that we live in. And that is the most challenging thing, and we're not talking for good reasons, probably. I mean, the intractable nature of this issue in New York. I mean, it's easier to see this in Ferguson because it's so stark, dramatic, an absurd contrast. It's more difficult to pinpoint this in New York, where we have, this friendly environment until we take the train to Brownsville, right? Whatever. So, and how a mayor can transform this reality, what impact he can make in this historic divide and this historic problem, I think it can make for a bigger, probably the legacy of de Blasio will be hopefully measured in how much impact he can make in transforming this. And I think if he can take this this challenge to his whole political vision, he will have to demonstrate that he's able to move politically beyond the everyday, the simple political game of the balancing act of trying to please the right wing and the right wing, because this goes well beyond that. He will have to demonstrate to himself and to all of us that he's a real leader, and that's the thing is still to be seen. I hope he can prove that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, what a great place to have this discussion at Gallatin. It's a perfect place to, I have tremendous respect for Gallatin and for its principles and what you try to espouse in terms of having us talk about things in this interdisciplinary, cross-sectoral way. Because if the city exemplifies anything, it exemplifies the complexity of the way societies are organized. And it's not as clear-cut as it once was, or as people used to think it was, whether that's by sector or by discipline. And I just really appreciate Gallatin asking us to come. We have a few more seats. If my stalwart standers want you to, oh, look, I might have won this guy over. Come on in. Come on, sit up there. I want to talk a little bit about, I want to get a discussion amongst us about a couple of key things that you've raised. Thank you for what each of you said. The city is a place. And so much of what you were talking about was process. I'm a Canadian, or I'm a dual, so I never remember what the American pronunciation is. Is it process or process? Process. So there, I almost did it. So, the city, if you talk about urban ecology is a process of interactions and interdependencies. And I thought that's where you were going when you started to talk about that. And I think that your colleagues here were all talking about, in many ways, how do you evaluate the process of the city, and is that progressive? I'm trying to imagine if you could look at the physical city, the spatial city, and say, oh, that's a progressive city. Give me a city in the world that you would eyeball and say, look at, and say that's a progressive city. Can you give me one? Do you think that way?
Well, when it comes to policing,
You might have to do this to make sure. But you see, you're going into a process. I want you to talk to me about the spatial city. Nobody wants to talk about that.
Say more what you mean by that.
Well, I think, if I might.
Go.
First of all, we're all New Yorkers, so no other cities really matter to anyone. So we should get that out of the way, right?
Okay, now that you've got that out of your system.
Right. I mean, I've been to Yonkers. It seemed nice, but there's no point venturing any further.
But you see what
I do see what I mean, and I think it's a good point, because I think that the not to suggest that my presentation was the most important, but the affordable housing plan.
Humble crowd.
Try. The affordable housing plan and the question of how the city uses its land and what is produced it's a process that actually does create and reshape that physical city. And I think that the question, I think a progressive city is a place where, you know, people of varying backgrounds and income levels can afford to live a decent life there in some number. I mean, I think that's
Okay,
what they're going for.
Okay, so you're describing an attribute. I mean, you're going to Karen's point, which was that let's talk about the progressive city. Let's forget about the progressive mayor or the progressive administration. Let's talk about the characteristics of a progressive city. And you're saying you would look at a city and you'd say, are there opportunities for mobility,
right.
right? And
Mobility and existence. I mean, they
Sure.
just being able to stay, let alone move up.
And
being able
mobility of
to-
all kinds.
Right.
Okay, so then I think if we were to just agree that that's sort of a starting point, that we're looking at that kind of attribute, and then we have to say to ourselves, what kind of control does the city administration have in affecting that mobility, which takes us to your point, because you were raising that in your view, the current approach to policing is inhibiting that mobility. Yes?
In some ways, yeah.
Get that mic in your mouth.
In some ways. Yeah, I mean, I think that, well, I was focused on this particular issue of quality of life policing, but like as I mentioned toward the end, I think he is performing a balancing act, and he has implemented some progressive reforms, and he has some very progressive people in his administration. But there is this one specific issue which does have a lot to do with the look of the city, and I mean, when we talk about broken windows, we're literally discussing the physical attributes of the city, and I think that that remains like the most contentious issue.
I mean, I remember when George Kelling's book first came out, and it was specifically, all those of you that are Googling broken windows, you'll find his book and that he wrote with his wife, and it was about property damage originally. It was just I'm going to really oversimplify it, but the idea was that if you take an action about something fairly minor, and you take an action on that, you will deter any kind of escalation to physical property damage. I'm not quite sure how that then has translated over a couple of decades into, boy, if we nailed him for marijuana use, we're going to stop the drug trade. You know, I don't know how it. Do you know what I'm getting at? How did it become? Try to have some kind of enforcement of litter, and you'll have a larger contribution to the physical city to then policing social behavior.
I mean, it's not completely illogical. I mean, the widespread, stopping and frisking and arrest of people for suspicion of marijuana or whatever did lead to the police taking lots of guns off of people. And that's one of the reasons why this sort of policing remains popular. It's still very popular in New York. And I would like to see that poll that we both referenced again, to see it broken down. But I think that quality of life policing is popular among people of color in New York too, in communities of color. Yeah, I think it's a sort of complicated thing, but I think there is an argument that can be, the argument has been made that if you crack down hard on minor crimes, you could, Braden cracked down on fare beaters, and he found that some of these people had been on the lam for other crimes, and it's not totally unreasonable. The question is, at what point does it violate constitutional rights, and at what point is it applied in such a way that it's racially biased?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and I think this notion that you take something and oversimplify it, and then so broadly apply it, it starts to mean nothing.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
All right, so over to you guys.
I just wanted to say something.
Grab that.
I think that one important point to be made there is that when broken windows started to be implemented in the 1990s, the city was coming out of the worst period. So I think that there is a social tolerance to certain more stronger measures. Right now, after 20 years of declining crime rates, etc., and the city became safer than probably ever. I think people, especially people who didn't live through, but not necessarily, but you're used to being in a much more safer environment. So it makes lesser sense to admit that it makes any sense to arrest someone just for sleeping. You can just put him up and move around, but why to put him in jail or the acrobats, right? So I think that the social climate that under the circumstances of 25, 30 years ago was much more favorable to a stronger approach to crime, and I think was the condition that allowed
So what's
for
your
Broken
sense of
Wings.
it now, the climate now?
That now people are most people react against those kind of you see in most people. I mean, it's true that in communities of color in the projects there is a much higher tolerance of the police, and they welcome the police because they are also where crime still is up in the rates of the whole city 25 years ago. And so so going back to your point of places, I mean, this is also a picture of a broken city, because people living in the projects live a very different New York that people live in even across Broadway. You have the grand houses on Broadway and the 125th, where this big crackdown went down a month or two ago. Columbia University is building up his humongous new campus across the street. And Hamilton Heights is becoming one of the most fast gentrified places in town. So just one block makes a world of difference. This is an all New York story, but this is even more so with broken windows, with policy, etc. So across Broadway, inside of the grand houses, you want the police to be there. You welcome the stronger approach. Across the street, we are all progressive and liberals, right? And I think it's important to how to breach that and to make.
So let's just talk about that. No, hang on to that
Okay.
microphone, because I'm going to pursue it with you. You guys can hear me, right? Okay. So the idea that, in my view, in a progressive city, is exactly that you can have those kinds of conditions coexist. That's part of what a progressive city is that there are different neighborhoods and different kinds of circumstances and different kinds of conditions, and that somehow in a progressive city, you allow that kind of intermingling and mixing and connective tissue to flourish.
Yeah, but it's
To
still
me,
you're gonna.
you can have lots of cities that are homogeneous. We all know them, although apparently no New Yorkers go anywhere else, but we all have been to cities like
That's
that.
not true. They're trying.
And they're boring, and they are homogeneous, and they are flat, and they are not creative places. So just talk to me about this, do you really want to homogenize it all?
I'd be okay with a city that was homogeneously safe, if that's the.
Okay.
And the point
I
you
agree.
make, the point you make is there's a spatial element to the crime story. The shootings are up in the city by like 10% over this time last year. But if you look precinct to precinct, about half the precincts have fewer shootings than last year. About half of them have zero and had zero last year. As crime,
And the ones where they're up, what do we know about the ones where it's up?
it's up a lot, and they tend to be up. The areas that you would suspect it's occurring in. But one of the functions of New York City's decline of crime over the past 20 years is that the crime that exists is increasingly concentrated in a few areas. It used to be you could walk down any street and theoretically think that someone might knife you to death. Now it is almost impossible to conceive of in some areas of the city. The level of safety I feel, walking through my neighborhood in the, kind of transitional area of the Bronx at 2 a.m. is absurd compared to how I felt 20 years ago in the same neighborhood as a college kid. And so because of that, I think we often are like having somewhat different conversations, about the risk of getting arrested, the risk of getting stopped and frisked, the risk of getting shot are so vastly different in areas. And that's, I certainly don't want a homogeneous city kind of culturally in terms of how, housing looks and all that stuff. But in terms of people feeling, safe and knowing that their kids aren't going to get killed, that would be one area I'd be okay for us to be almost Stalinist in our equanimity.
Okay, I get that. All right, be like that. So.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the other thing I would say is I am still really thinking about this big divide that poll showed, and the fact that, even with stop and frisk, it became so much in the news, but, I was in a group spending a day studying stop and frisk, and the white people in the room either had no direct experience or even not even an intellectual interest necessarily in it. And the people of color in the room, everyone had a direct experience that was deep, that was deeply a part of a sense of lack of respect in this city. And so I guess what I want to put out there is we can't have a progressive city with those divides. We need to find a way that people can come together and understand each other's situations with more empathy. And we need to, to make those imaginative leaps past our segregation that exists. And, I say the word respect as if, I'm embarrassed to say it because it's not hard thing. But I think it comes down to that in so many situations. When I talk to people, like, to me, a great, wonderful city that I want to live in is one where I am delighted to live in my neighborhood, where I feel I belong, where I know my neighbors, where I feel like, I'm part of the fabric of that community. And there are so many people that I hear say, I feel like a stranger in my own community now because of gentrification, because they can't afford it, because newcomers don't respect their cultures. So I think respect is a pretty big part of the city. And how that could express itself is in a number of ways. I mean, the other physical thing I wanted to put out there is just basic culture, basic infrastructure, neighborhood infrastructure. There is such an inequity that exists. Mm-hmm. So in my realm, in the cultural realm, you have these big, wonderful cultural institutions, which I love and I certainly want to keep. But neighborhoods deserve to have big, wonderful cultural hubs that really play a role in the community. We deserve to have plazas that are vital. We need things that neighbors can feel like they really own.
So I was just hang on a mic, because I think the point that you're making is that there are some ways to spatially organize the city, create those hard assets that do engender respect, do foster different kinds of interactions, yes? At the neighborhood level and at the citywide level. And I think that's what you're speaking to. Is that not an opportunity for this administration to invest differently?
Definitely is a way to set a tone where we can really support cultural hubs and support the intersection between different neighborhood cultural hubs, and using schools and libraries and making it more possible for them to function as civic spaces outside of their just being schools or libraries. I also think the mayor and the administration can set a tone around these issues, around this bridging this segregation and these different experiences, and be very purposeful in setting that tone. And I didn't see that happen so much.
The mayor
recently.
did run on, he established that meme, A Tale of Two Cities. He pretty much said this, echoing what you guys are already describing. And so I guess part of the challenge, I think, from our point of view, would be how do you challenge the administration to concretize then? How do we bridge those two worlds, those two cities? I saw you make a note. Do you want to say something?
Oh, no.
Okay. It's your to-do list.
Multitasking. I will say that I was stopped at the question once, and it was a true learning experience.
Mm-hmm.
I had my NYPD issued press pass in my pocket and was doing nothing wrong and spent a lot of my day dealing with the police, and it still was a terrifying experience. So I will say that you're right, that somehow being able to imagine, and obviously I still had to do some imagining what it would be like to be a young person of color in that experience, but it was definitely eye-opening.
I'm going to continue to try to force a discussion where we talk about the physical and the spatial city at the same time as we talk about all these other things that contribute to it, because I think that they're intertwined, and we have to think carefully about what a mayor's purview is and what a city administration has control over. So they have a bully pulpit, which is part of what you're suggesting. There can be a lot, and I think that this mayor has made good use of that, advocated in all sorts of passionate ways for a certain set of values through the campaign and into the administration. And then there are actual things that the administration could do. So I have a question about rules. Do you want to see an administration that provides more rules or fewer rules?
I think that there are enough rules in this city, in this country.
So you want fewer rules?
No, I mean, I think when you compare this, I mean, I'm from Argentina, so we won
Right.
4-2. If there are any Germans in the room, We want to. But the thing is that I think that, again, it breaks down to an issue of race and social class and education, which are intermingled. My experience is that most people in this country has incorporated the rules. And one of the things that shock many people in the interaction with newcomers, especially from South America, my most immediate experience in the neighborhoods and where so-called white people, which is also a very large conglomerate of people, right? And Latinos, also a big conglomerate. That much of the cultural shocks are a shock of rules, or people who come from societies where there are no rules, or there are other rules, right? Or the rule is just to jump the line and make it. Whereas in this country, in this city, one of the things that struck me the most was how people were respectful of lines. And in every neighborhood, and in every black people, white people, and line for the cashier, line for the bus. And if you look in Washington Heights, for instance, or a large Dominican population, there's no lines. And you can be talking to...
And if you go to Asia, I mean, they're really, the line is
Well,
one
there
thing.
you are. So I think that there is an implicit sense of a civilized, a respectful, to pick up your word, respectful way of living in a city is to play along the rules. And I think that most people have this incorporated. The thing about the public rules is that, again, I think we have a lot of them. And the public advocate is going to present soon a project of, response to broken windows, where specifically she's going to say what some of you said earlier, that to replace the arrest by summons, by going back to the old, way, old 50 years ago or something. You don't really need to enforce a rule to make sense of the broken windows. Maybe the broken windows theory is good in theory, right? And again, in a certain context where you have to reduce drastically the crime rates and insecurity, it made a lot of sense. In a context where the insecurity is not as big as it was 25, 30 years ago, it doesn't make sense. And so the intelligent way is to see, okay, we don't need to bring these people down to because they don't have the tag for the cigarettes, or because they are doing these acrobacies in the subway or whatever. Maybe we can just put a summons or whatever. So I think it's a way of also making common sense of rules, because this is certainly not working, and politically it's not working for the mayor. So it already is a big problem.
Well, I think it's a bit counterintuitive. I mean, I think if we're saying the city would be more progressive if we had an easing of rules.
Well, there are a lot of different rules, right? So we imposed, or the city, de Blasio imposed a rule with the city council's help that businesses had to offer sick leave. So that's like a rule that I think was a good thing.
Yep.
Impose a rule, or we have reiterated a rule that the police department's not supposed to use chokeholds. So that's another rule that I think. When I think of the spatial city and the question of equity, I think the rule we're going to talk about most is zoning rules, which New York City effectively, invented, and it was the Supreme Court case involving rules here that established them as legal. That's how we control the physical look of the city, not just size and density, but everything from the look of buildings to different uses and mixing of uses. And I think that's going to play into a lot of the very complex questions about equity and diversity in the city. Questions about affordable housing versus manufacturing versus office space.
But there might be some rules we could dump. I mean, there are rules that you can't own a business, you can't operate a business in your house.
Right.
We might dump that one, right? We have a bunch of rules around mixed use. We've gradually, I think, come to realize that it's okay, actually, that we could have both have different kinds of uses in our adjacent spaces, and we could probably coexist and work it out. We don't necessarily have to have a rule that prohibits me from doing that. So there's probably some rules that could be eased, and others, as you suggest, are positive rules.
But I'm curious if there is this divide, this tale of two cities, and there isn't equity yet. and there needs to be proactive steps taken towards equity. I think those are going to take the form of some rules. I'm just thinking on a small level, I'm involved in participatory budgeting, and, it's sort of the democracy, we're all talking, we're all doing things, and now we're in our 4th year in our district, and all of a sudden I'm like the woman saying, we need rules. That's like so not me. And I'm
What's
like,
happened to you?
we're having our next meeting and it's going to be all about rules because of equity issues, because equity doesn't always happen naturally. And so I'd be curious to hear from other folks here what rules that increase equity look like.
I mean, I think this is, I see people ready to go with the audience, and we're gonna go right out to you in a sec. Do we need to put a mic out there, or can they just bellow? So let me just summarize a couple things. We're wrestling back and forth with what's the role of the spatial city and the physical city, and where do we see the administration potentially providing leadership in that way. Then there's also this idea of the kind of moral leadership that a mayor can provide and that an administration can provide. And then this notion that we're just starting to wrestle with now about to what extent do we want to materialize our aspirations in new rules, new legislation, new kinds of regulations, or do we want to see an easing in some of it? So it sounds like we might want to get tighter in some areas, but looser in others, maybe. Okay, a differentiated view. Let's hear from the audience. Who wants to go? You had your hand here at the front. Yeah.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Trina Rose. I'm a native New Yorker. And I didn't always mean to be the spokesperson for disabled people in the city, but I just happen to always find myself in that role. I'm also an artist, and when I visualize my city, when we talk about equity, we talk about development or civic engagement, I see open doors, I see wide open doors, I see accessible cities.
Uh-huh.
Symbolically, metaphorically, and physically. And some of us in the disability community in New York right now there were 2 pages dedicated to disabled New Yorkers in the affordable housing thing that came out. And the fact of the matter is, I mean, I don't want to throw statistics at you guys and bore you with that, but there's a lot that our city needs to do to be accessible, to be open. And, disability is a social process. It's not something that some of us have, but when we talk about a tale of 2 cities or several cities, it's quite different from down here, whether you're in a wheelchair or accessibility it's a big thing, and
So
I just want to bring that more to
So
the
do you have an
discussion.
expectation that the mayor would be providing specific policy leadership on making the city more open?
Yeah, I want to just point out some things that I do like. I like the new websites.
Uh-huh.
The mayor's office for people with disabilities. The 311 website is accessible for information. Voting access, we're still in the midst of, but yeah, investment in access, that's what I want to see. I want to see more social agencies speaking to each other, so it's not so
Siloed.
yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
And I know we're not here to talk about housing, but I want folks to emphasize that as much as possible, that housing for people with disabilities is extraordinarily important.
Okay.
And
Thank you.
just one more thing, just last year, a couple of friends of mine pushed for, in 2020, in year 2020, 50% of the new taxi fleet will be accessible.
Mhm.
So it's efforts like that, it's things like that. And a lot of the time, de Blasio doesn't have the funds specifically from the city, and he needs to work with Cuomo. I just want to see a lot more of that happening.
I mean, it's interesting. Thank you. We'll put the mic down to the next person. Maybe at the back. There's some guys at the back if you want to go to the back and work with them. Jared made a point about, when you look back on the legacy, the de Blasio legacy, what will you remember? And it's interesting to kind of reverse it that way, think what the hallmarks are. One of the things you'd say is more accessibility, more open, a higher degree of accessibility of taxis. These are great tangible suggestions of the way in which America could distinguish itself. Yes, at the back. Sir.
Yeah, I've really loved some of the discussion about civic engagement. About
Who
more.
are you?
My name's John Guzik. I'm actually an urban fellow right now with New York City government. I'm here actually with a few other urban fellows too.
Welcome, Urban Fellows.
Yeah,
Good to have you
yeah.
fellows here.
So we are very excited about Mayor de Blasio, but of course we love discussions like these that cause us to question things.
Okay.
And so I've loved some of the discussion about participatory decision making, especially when it comes to arts and culture. I think it's notable, of course, that we don't have anyone on the panel discussing participatory business models. Of moving in that direction, or anything regarding, let's say, employee ownership, or really business models that are more inclusive when it comes to that sort of thing, which I think is really notable. That, of course, has been a step that de Blasio has taken in investing those small, only $1.2 million into worker cooperatives, actually, with his past budget. But still the largest, obviously, municipal investment that's ever been made in U.S. history.
So, John, in your view, that would be a more progressive hallmark of the economy?
So, yeah, that's what I'm asking you, I guess, is participatory decision-making, I think, is critical.
At all scales.
Is the bottom line, exactly, yeah, to really
Okay, let's get the panel to respond.
And so, yeah, that's my question is,
Got some comments?
where does that come into play, I guess?
Let's go.
I think that, part of the backdrop, let me start that sentence for the fifth time, part of the backdrop to de Blasio's election, I think, is not just the idea that there was an inequality crisis, but that there was an engagement crisis in the city. And I think the increased interest in participatory budgeting from an original, I think, 4 council members to 9 or 10 to, I think, 22 this year is a really positive step in the direction of trying to, get people engaged in the act of governing again, so that government has relevance and credibility with them. And I think you could extend that to other spheres of life. The question, obviously, is you're getting into an intersection between, what the powers of the city are and where they end. And I think that, encouraging entrepreneurship, making it possible for people to, engage in the private sector on their own, as opposed to, trying to, force businesses to be more participatory, which they probably won't be, is one step the city could take. But I think that question and the very good previous question go to a point you made earlier about sort of limits to the mayor's power. And I think one of the big issues as far as accessibility goes is the transit system. I mean, as bad as everything else is, the transit system is horrible, and that is an area where the mayor has limited overview. So that's one of the areas where either by forcing Andrew Cuomo to do something, or using his powers of persuasion, or taking someone hostage, the mayor has to use extra legal means to achieve some progress.
Anybody else want to comment on participatory business?
I do. Thank you. And so I want to just first say the thing I love about participatory budgeting is you budget, yeah, but you get an appetite for participating in other realms. I mean, for me, the big part of the definition of progressive is not that you're told the progressive agenda, but that you gain agency to create your progressive agenda. And that's what I see PB doing. Even for people who aren't happy with the process, ultimately they get pissed off and they get involved. And it gives you that drive to get engaged. Now, in terms of the business, I think that, the government doesn't have to do everything, and that there's some really great efforts that are going on through nonprofits and through other and through business, and that there could be private-public partnerships. So, for example, there's Solidarity NYC as a network of co-ops and other solidarity economy groups that are participatory. The government could find ways to support their efforts to map what's out there and support it. It doesn't have to reinvent them.
Wouldn't it be great if we could make participation contagious? Do you want to bring the mic down? There's a person here, and then we'll come to you. Because it's a sort of pervasive quality. I mean, as we're getting that mic set up, I'm tracking on these values, what the progressive city exemplifies: tolerance, mobility, empathy, an integrated social fabric, respect, openness, accessibility, an appreciation of innovation, more participatory decision-making, higher degrees of agency. They're all kind of linked in a notion, a set of values. Yes, behind here. Where's the mic?
Hi.
Now?
Hello.
Yes.
Hi.
Hi.
Hello. Okay, there we go. Hi, my name's Karen Lowe. I'm a writer and urbanist in the neighborhood, and I'm wondering something that I haven't really heard spoken to is just raw power. Who has the power in the city? And if we're moving from an administration A, when certain groups had power, to administration B, when everything's changing, so presumably other groups are going to have power. Is that happening? I mean, under Bloomberg, I think we had the impression that, for example, the real estate lobby had plenty of power, and the financial sector had plenty of power. And so is that still true? You know, students of Washington talk about the permanent government, and you know, various representatives come and go, but there are people who are just always there and are actually running things. So could you all speak to that?
Who's got the power?
I'll wait on that. I think, Karen. I guess the way I think about it is that it's I don't know if it's a permanent government, but there's there's like a poker game, and at one time or another, people have different size piles of chips in front of them. And I think, under Bloomberg, all the chips or most of the chips were in the financial community and real estate. Those guys are still at the table. They haven't folded. They never will. But I think now you see that other communities and loci of power have some skin to play with. Unions. Some community groups, some elements of the communities of color in the city. So I think there's a mix in the city, and I think there has been a shift. I don't think anyone who was important to Bloomberg's survival or Bloomberg's government, I don't think any of those people have gone away to some sort of government in exile. But I think their power is definitely diminished. I mean, it's there. De Blasio has to reassure the business community when he does something, and there's definitely, after the election, there was some currying of favor with them to make sure they didn't freak out about him. And I think selecting Bratton and selecting Anthony Shores was a lot about reassuring them and making sure they didn't, go ape. But so they're there, but they definitely have had to take a step back. What'll be interesting is to see if they will make a decision at some point as to whether they're going to remain sort of, on impulse power into 2017, whether they're going to accept de Blasio, whether they're going to get behind someone else.
What do you think, Karen? Where do you think the power is?
Well, I guess I don't know. I wonder about the real estate lobby and the financial sector, and obviously, with the growth of participatory budgeting, that's a meaningful change. I see meaningful changes, but I wonder if the business interests aren't still, calling shots to some degree. I mean, but on the other hand, one big change that would indicate something else is de Blasio's awarding of tremendous, back pensions to teachers. And some would argue that's at a real economic cost to the rest of us. So, by that measure, maybe teachers have a heck of a lot more power now than they used to.
I mean, I just wonder if it's a bit early. Can anybody think of a decision that's been made that you could look at, other than these appointments where you think that he was acting out of trying to reassure people? But can you actually see a decision that's been made where you could say, he was influenced by so-and-so? And have you got an answer? Has there been a decision made?
Well, this is going to be a part of my question to the panel.
So you're segueing beautifully. We'll get the mic over to you. And you
Yeah,
can Karen's going to respond.
I was just going to throw out, I was curious what other people thought of this, but it seemed like over the last few years, in the city council at least, the Progressive Caucus started to take more and more power. And now, in some ways, the Progressive Caucus is leading the council. And the Progressive Caucus is very allied with labor and groups tied to them. So that does feel like a shift to me.
Okay, now do you want to respond, and then we'll go to the front? Go.
Yeah, I just wanted to talk about how there are all these new public-private partnerships and all these sort of coalitions across sectors across society, where through the Jobs for New Yorkers task force, through Generation Tech, which is a beautiful public-private, and then through the funding of new technical high schools of the CUNYs, which is and new specialized high schools, which is funded not only by CUNY and by SUNY, but also by
You mean his approach to kind of collaborative, inclusive process is somehow
Yeah.
gonna reduce it to the lowest common denominator? That gentleman just used that mic as a prop, really. He didn't actually use it. So maybe are you gonna speak to this and actually speak into it? Yep, that could be a point. Maybe it needs to be on. Is it on?
No.
It's not on. No wonder it's a prop. But before we go to you, let's hear from my gang. What do you think? I mean, do you feel that that's happening? That this effort to kind of make a big tent all the time is going to diminish the capacity to be able to deliver a progressive agenda?
I don't know.
Is it too early?
It's too early.
What do you think?
I haven't given it a moment's thought, but
Now's your moment.
I'm gonna go with that.
I could save you if you wanna.
Go.
All right, so I just
Your mic is on.
mic is on now. So I just came. I'm a longtime New York resident. I went to D.C. to work for a New York City member of Congress, and then to work for the Obama administration. And we actually worked in economic development, and I could assure you that partnership, public-private partnership with business, labor, and regular folks is actually the most progressive thing that we could do. And I think that, this young lady said she didn't want to be the spokesperson of the ADA community. I don't want to be the spokesperson for the African American or people of color community, but I think that what would be truly progressive, and even better than progressive, but what would be right, what would make sense, is if we address those economic opportunities, those partnership opportunities, with the same vigor that we did with the broken window theory, right? There's just so many opportunities out there in advanced manufacturing and technology, and we're really not doing that much about it.
So could you just think of a cute little name for a broken window, except a price?
It's a damn shame. That's what broken window is.
The damn shame campaign. But
Right. That's me and you. We need to go into business
exactly,
together.
but we need something that speaks to. I mean, let me tell you where we see it. We see it in the sharing economy.
Right.
So those guys understand the marketing piece. They were able to come up with a sort of common attribute to what that kind of aspect of the economy was doing, often tech-enabled, and they came up with that phrase, sharing economy. So now people code that back and forth. Are you enabling the sharing economy or not? So what is this kind of economic transformation that you want to see realized?
I'm sure.
Administration could deliver?
I'm sure we could come up with a cute term or something like that, impact investing or social entrepreneurship, something like that. But I just to kind of be a little less superficial than the term, we just need to put our weight behind that. I mean, there's too much at stake. There's from an actual what we produce side, but also from you mentioned that people were getting stopped and frisked looking for not to get off the point, but I'm sorry. There's just too much at stake, and we're putting our all of our attention and all of our effort, or too much of our effort, in one space, when we should be actively recruiting people across communities, across colors, to be engaged in the economic opportunities that would probably lead to the decline in some of the socials that we see in the city.
So just riffing off the previous comment, and we're going to bring the mic down here to the front row to this gentleman that's been patiently waiting. The idea of partnerships working across silos and sectors, and then can you open up new opportunity, right? Could you actually create, and is there some way to marshal a really broad consensus around and there are steps that the government could take around local procurement, they've already started to do it, around fair waging. There are ways in which the local government leadership could enhance the opportunity for people to be able to have a greater agency through
But
economic
just to
opportunity.
speak to your nagging doubt for a second, I mean,
His nagging doubt.
your nagging doubt, and not to say that it shouldn't happen, but what happens when there's a conflict of interest? I mean, when you were talking about the technology, I started thinking about net neutrality. And so what happens is that issue getting talked about in certain partnerships because it may be, somebody's getting excited here. I feel like I want to hear. I mean, well, even things that are great, right? You want to have some cautionary notes. And I guess my cautionary note is, can we make sure that certain issues get not pushed aside
So we're back
because
to
of
rules. We're back to whether rules can protect.
Right.
So
Can I
want
let me jump in
Jared's
on
gonna
that.
jump, and then we'll go back to this woman who's so agitated. We'll get to you. Don't worry.
I think
You'll riff after him.
the point. I think the point that if a partnership between whoever gets you where you need to go, then it doesn't matter. You don't need to be sort of pure in any sense that it has to be an all government thing. I think the cautionary note I feel is thinking about things like parks conservancies, which I feel are rather problematic, and where you have this partnership between private funding and a public park, but it tends to be focused on a particular neighborhood, and it raises questions about overall equity. It raises questions about private money supplanting what should be supported by the public. So I think as long as there isn't that, as long as there's a true alignment, maybe for different motives, but if there's a true alignment in your goals, whatever the partners are, then it makes sense. If Citibank wants to underwrite capital improvements to NYCHA developments, and that's not going to displace anybody, then great. Who cares if someone makes a dime off of it? But I don't think every partnership lends itself to that.
No, and I think your point would be that if that were the deal, it would have to somehow distribute across NYCHA developments. It couldn't just be in a couple of neighborhoods.
Right.
Yeah, but I think I guess the question is a longer topic. We should come back next week, talk about park equity, because the dilemma is that you've already got those conservancies in place, and you're not going to likely dismantle them, but I hear you totally. You've got lots of parks that don't have rich donors, and so surely to goodness, if any city in the world can imagine a more equitable way of approaching that, it should be us. We should be able to figure out a way to leverage private investment to improve those civic commons assets that we know of and distribute them more equitably. There's got to be a way to do it. It can't just be all going to Central Park. Okay, you're going to go after him. So this gentleman, and then back to this woman again.
Is this on? I just wanted to ask you, is this on?
And who are you?
Oh, okay. My name's Dan, and I'm in the community here. And I had a question about the nature of progressivism and the changing notions of it. Because, when I was a student, any panel discussion on progressivism would probably have as a fundamental issue economic inequality and redistribution of wealth. Particularly in a city where the richest city in the world, where you have the wealth divide that we have here. And I haven't really heard much discussion about that from this panel tonight, or really from de Blasio. I mean, there was some campaign discussion, but I don't really see that as being anything that he's done kind of much about. For example, taxation, which he could clearly, tax wealthy people and redistribute that to people who need it.
Well, he's made a commitment to taxing people over $500,000 to pay for pre-K. That was in the platform. He tried. Couldn't get it. But I mean, so we had an aspiration, whether or not he's.
But I wonder whether you could just speak to the broader issue of the changing nature of the discourse on progressivism that, maybe with Occupy and so on, and some of the old style discussion came back, and I don't know, it's now kind of submerged again. I didn't really hear much of it from the panel tonight, I guess, would be my comment.
Let's hear them respond.
I'm not equipped to talk about the way that ideas about progressivism have changed, if they have, and I don't know that they have. I think mine probably aligns with yours. But I would just make the point that I think some of the ideas you're talking about are in the background of some of the things that de Blasio is doing and that he has prioritized. During the campaign, when he talked about affordable housing, the way he framed it was to say that Bloomberg and his administration, through the rezonings, had given away billions and billions of dollars in public value in terms of air rights and development rights to wealthy developers. And that part of his goal in using zoning and other tools to try to wrest some of that value back for middle, moderate, and low-income people was in and of itself a redistributive act. So it's not about necessarily using the tax system, although he did attempt that and was thwarted by the governor. But I think there are other aspects of what he's trying to do that get at that basic idea, but maybe just through different means. Those are my 2 cents.
Well, and certainly the wage initiative. I mean, I think there are other initiatives that have been trying to deal with it. Do you want to speak on it?
I mean, I think he addressed income inequality head on, and now we're talking around it. We're talking around the edges of it, and it seems like he's been working around the edges of it. But this also goes to your point earlier about how, like, we've been talking about stop and frisk, and and policing and crime in low-income communities and police abuse in low-income communities, but there's also a conversation that we weren't having about, you know, what kind of measures can be taken to lift those communities so that this isn't an issue in the first place. So at the point at which you're talking about policing the drug trade, for example, you know, in a poor neighborhood, and the disproportionate crackdown on drug traffic in poor neighborhoods, you're already sort of past the point where one would ask, you know, why is the drug trade focused in that neighborhood? You know, why is the outdoor drug trade focused in that neighborhood? And I think that's a good thing to consider.
And I would say, just in the arts, just from the arts side, that really is where the cultural equity conversation is. It's about who's the money going to, and who should it be going to, and where the inequities are, and how do you address them. I think the other place that I hear it related to arts and culture, which I think is really interesting, is, and this came out of Occupy Labor, the idea, or Arts and Labor, was the idea of all of these mega art fairs happening on public land and pretty much getting it for nothing and taxing them and having that money go. And in the case of the arts, it's saying, you know, if it's happening on public land, let's tax what's sold and create a fund for the community to support community cultural work. I mean, I think we are talking about jobs a lot, and I think that really gets into that too, and what kind of jobs are being supported. And that is a topic that should be talked about as a progressive agenda.
Just briefly, I think that if you think in general, compared to the rest of the world, any political discussion of what is a progressive, what is a left-wing policy, the United States has always been more to the center, to the right center than the rest of the world. So I think that today, to talk about, let's just go any revolution aside, it's a too far-fetched idea, but wealth redistribution, I think it's just a political loser in this country at this point. And I think that, you know, without saying that, what the mayor is trying to do is, I believe, is trying to devise some policy that can make a direct impact on, a long-term impact on redistribution of wealth, or at least an equipping people more with better instruments to get a better life. And certainly the pre-K is his idea of that. And I think it's still to be seen if that's the case, because when you instrument that, when you put that in place, I mean, in theory it's a great idea. But then the implementation is showing what the real problems are in the reality that we are not directly addressing. We have to do with class, with economic, with race, with class, with location, where the people live, and you know what kind of actual, and social capital, which is I think a term that I haven't heard much, but I think is crucial, you know, to understand why intergenerational wealth is something that has to be addressed in an intergenerational fashion perspective, right? So when you look at the people, you know, who are more trapped in poverty in this country, you will find, of course, certain basic issues and traits that go back to a situation 100 years or more ago, right? How you know, and how to build actual and effective tools through education or through social participation or through other means that actually allow and permit the creation and the transfer of social capital. I think is the big challenge, and it's a big challenge for anyone. And I'm not sure if the mayor is thinking in these terms, really. I think that's the way we should think, because we can't go just the usual socialist way or social democratic way, the European way of, although New York is pretty much a social democratic city when you compare it.
I guess my follow-up question then is, what sense is he a progressive?
My view is that it's, to be a progressive today in the terms of the mayor is framing it is, if you compare it with the old, 70s or 60s or 1940s way of progressive, is very tepid. It's very, washed out, right? Washed down. But it's probably the only kind of progressive that you can have today, at least in the United States.
Say another thing. I think he's a progressive in the classic sense, in that he's trying to reduce income inequality to the extent that he can. I just think that, like I said, I think those efforts are sometimes playing out on what might seem like the margins to you, where, taking measures to ensure that, fewer people are stopped and frisked and end up with a criminal record, that's the same as taking measures to ensure that people will have an easier time finding jobs, right? But, it also raises the question about what are you doing, not just to make sure that they don't have trouble finding jobs, but to promote the, employment opportunities. I want to just talk a little bit more about these subway dancers, because I've been spending some time with them and I'm working on a longer piece about them. And it's easier for me to think about these things in terms of the specific, in terms of the concrete example of actual people. But there's this one young man who I've spent some time with, who he may be exceptional among this cadre of dancers in that he's very ambitious and intent on breaking away from the confines of the subway and neighborhood dance battles and other places where the scene has been concentrated, and he wants to make it in the corporate world, and he's not exactly sure what that will look like or how he'll get there, but he wants to make it as a professional dancer and has certain corporate aspirations, and he printed up a stack of business cards and gives them out whenever he's on the subway. And although he tries to avoid the subway now, partly because of the arrest and partly because there's more competition now from other dancers for money, the subway is still really important to him because it's a networking opportunity. It's an opportunity for him to meet people who he might not meet in his neighborhood in the South Bronx. And these people are inviting him to perform at office parties. And so when I spend time with him, I see someone who's incredibly ambitious and hardworking and wildly talented, who has latched onto the subway as one of his best opportunities for making it out of his neighborhood. And he's getting arrested as a result of that. So one question is, why is he getting arrested? Should he be getting arrested? What effect is that having on him? And what can de Blasio do to stop that without sacrificing the political capital that he needs to implement these other reforms? The other question is, what can de Blasio do to ensure that a young man like this will be able to not just avoid criminalization in the police and jail, but have opportunities, be encouraged and supported as he tries to attain the goal of economic self-sufficiency?
Fundamentally, the city was a vehicle for economic opportunity. That's why we all formed cities. That's why thousands and thousands and millions of people continue to go to cities. So your anecdote is a perfect anecdote where he's treating the subway as an element of the civic commons to build social capital so that he has more networks that then allow him to have more opportunity. So I think the interesting thing for a mayor would be to say, how do I find other ways to encourage that kind of interaction, serendipity, all those kinds of exchanges that happen in a city that do not happen in a small town, and that guy has the potential to have something extraordinary. He could develop something extraordinary, which he's going to have a hard time doing in Poughkeepsie, with all due respect to Poughkeepsie. So, it's a great town. So I think, we're here to talk about the potential, the promise of municipal leadership in, I think, achieving a progressive agenda. So whether he's a progressive or not remains to be seen. The question is, what tools does he have at his disposal that he has any control over? And that's what we're sort of
He's progressive. I don't think that should be questioned about him or his intentions. I think that the question is, to what degree he can really, or how much progressive, not only de Blasio, but anyone can be in this town now. And I think that we have to judge him by the results of his policies, but also taking into account, the constraints the actual constraints that he have.
I mean, it's interesting. I bet we could all paint a picture of a city that's not progressive. I think we could all pretty much draw, we say 10 years from now, he's had 2 terms. If the city looks like this, it will have been the failure of the progressive agenda. I think we can pretty much draw that picture. The dilemma we're having is how do we draw what the progressive one is? This gentleman and then this woman.
And just to, I think you're talking a lot about taxation, and I think we haven't talked about home rule issues too. And I think that's part of what's needed for a progressive city is we need to be able to, for the mayor to make more decisions.
So more autonomy for the city. We've got a couple people here. We've got a woman over here. Carol, are you ready? You're gonna go?
Yeah, I can.
Jump, and then we'll go all 3 if you can get it.
Okay, my name is Faith. I live in Brooklyn. I'm a filmmaker, and I'm also a Gallatin alumna. Yay. Oh, no. Yeah, clap until you see my student loan bill. Then you won't be clapping.
And you're a filmmaker.
And I'm a filmmaker. Okay, very quick. Although the gentleman in the front pretty much stole my thunder, because basically my question or comment was going to be, I think we have to, how do you even define progressivism at this point? I mean, what is a progressive at this point? And it, I think, these 2 gentlemen, I don't think public-private partnerships per se are the issue. I think actually they can be great opportunities. But my point is that if there's some biotech company that's coming up with some great device, I don't necessarily want Pfizer to help give them money, because then it becomes proprietary. There's proprietary issues depending on what a product going out is like. Could there be potential price gouging? Could it be if somebody has this great idea for environmental sustainability, do we really want them getting money from BP? And it comes. I believe your name is Karen. Your point about conflict of interest and who controls what and what's being revealed about, how investments are being made and what's being done with those investments. And I think,
So Faith, what do you want? You want more public capital?
Yes, I think definitely, particularly as a filmmaker, yes, more public capital. More financing, which I know is like a pipe dream, but yes, more financing, more public financing, and also just more disclosure so that we know, who's involved with what and whose pockets may or may not be getting, lined or whatever. I think there's a lot of secrecy as far as, with companies that are happening, that, or just we just don't, and you see that in politics with super PAC. Obviously this is going on beyond de Blasio, but I think,
So a value that you'd like to see in his administration would be transparency.
Well, absolutely, and I think Obama.
Obama.
I know you're running very.
I'm running out of time. I want to get to this person.
Okay, but very quickly, because Obama promised, transparency too, and he was the progressive president, and that hasn't happened. And just very, very, very quickly, no, we'll have that conversation later. Anyway, but very quickly, I think I just want to say I don't want to live in a city where progressivism is defined by predominantly white, predominantly rich people. That's not, if they're going to be the ones defining what progressivism is, then I'm going to go somewhere else.
Got it. Okay, over here and then back here.
I really like history. And in New York City, there were 2 big moments in the 20th century where we got a real expansion of progressive urban policy. One was around World War II and immediately after, right? We had a huge strike wave, giant rent strikes, we got rent control, we got an expansion of public hospitals, we've got a lot of social welfare programs, we had basic freeze on mass transit costs, we got huge public housing, and then an expansion of that through the struggles of people of color in the 60s, right? Around CUNY and whatnot. And it seems like the horizon of what we are talking about is so truncated that 40 years of steady, brutal losses. And we're incredibly excited about universal pre-K. And I'm very excited about universal pre-K. It's great. Pre-K was really expensive for my child. But I'm wondering how we can expand the political horizons of what we are imagining and talking about. And that I would argue that this notion around participation, around public-private partnerships is a huge part of the problem. That defining progressiveness in terms of participation of actors that have radically different economic interests makes it very difficult to imagine solutions that might come at a great deal of cost to those with wealth. And so my question is, what kind of work happening now could actually significantly expand the political horizons of what seems possible to us, what the available landscape is?
Okay, I just want to get a couple more questions, and then the panel will have a last word. Just your question. Who else is
Well, so I agree with you, and I just was going to hook on up until the point where you say that public
use that mic.
Up until the point where it doesn't work. Up until you say that public-private partnership is not the way to go. The fact of the matter is that we have very, very low bar for what we're aiming for. Right? You were saying like,
okay, I want you to just wrap a question so these guys can respond. Because I'm running out of time.
Like, not stopping or frisking somebody. That's one of the main things we could do to allow somebody to get a job. But when in fact it's a very low bar. Right? I think what we need to do, what we ought to do, that the New York City as an economic engine, as something that could move industry, as something that could influence throughout the world, we have to, a progressive thing to do would be to show that works, that we can do things that are seemingly, we can bring together interests that are seemingly disparate and make them work for the common person. And at that point, that's truly progressive.
Okay.
But in some cases,
okay. Let's let this panel respond, and then we're going to break. Go. Who wants to jump in?
I agree with your historical analysis. I think that the problem is that for 40 years, the idea that government can be a positive force in our lives has been devalued, and therefore the idea that someone should pay for it has been devalued. And that's why you don't get the buy-in that people should based on their own self-interest. So I think the only thing we can do is to take the few victories that we're seeing, whether it's living wage or UPK, participate in shaping them, and I think when they work, and this is weird for me to say as a professional nitpicker, but kind of celebrate them, because the idea that the people acting through government can have a positive impact on intangible, unapproachable forces like inequality, gentrification, globalization, all of that stuff. The idea that that's even possible needs to be kind of rehabilitated. And I think you have to do that one step at a time. You know, there's no other way.
Well, I agree with you that it's a really low bar. And, you know, I guess as a reporter, at least the kind of reporting I do, I spend most of my time writing about problems and not a ton of time thinking about solutions. So hearing everyone else, including everyone in the audience who's talked about different ideas for solutions so far, has been very interesting to me. I should say, when you first asked what would a progressive city look like, the immediate dumb and obvious answer that popped into my head was, Seattle. And I was there recently working on a story about how the police in Seattle sort of begrudgingly have stopped locking up drug dealers and drug users in one neighborhood, and instead are referring them to a social service agency that provides people with housing, free housing, clean clothes, job training services, counseling, basically anything that someone would need to live like a safe and healthy life and get off the streets. And it was very instructive and interesting to see how even in that very progressive city, a conservative police force came around so fully on and it discarded everything that they'd learned in the academy and became almost reluctantly or unwittingly became like revolutionaries. And so that was a solution that I have written about and that I have thought about, and the way it happened, at least in Seattle, was that There was a police commander who I think was very a complex person who had a lot of doubts about the way he was doing things and was courageous in taking these steps. And there was also an activist lawyer who was suing him, attacking him in court, and relentlessly making his life miserable, so that he felt that it would be easier to make a change. And I guess that's the moral. You know, I think if you do care about these things, then don't let up.
Okay, two last comments to Karen and then Claudia.
I love the question, and I think that for me, participation isn't bad if it's tied to movement building, and that it's good when it's tied to movement building, that we should look at groups like the Alliance for Just Rebuilding, the New York Environmental Justice Alliance, other movements that have had to spend so much of their energy fighting against, but have great visions for and provide opportunities for them to actually, organize for what they're for. I would say that, like, after Sandy, I think a lot of us were involved in efforts where we saw people, the best in people and the willingness in people to really imagine things way beyond what was ever possible. I was involved in that in my work after Sandy. A lot of people in Occupy Sandy had that experience. And then it kind of went back to business as usual. It's like somehow after a crisis, we can make leaps, but then we can't make them structural. We can't actually make the leap and then address the inequities and then structurally, but to be that better self, to not hold ourselves back. And so that's what I'd like to see, is us imagine from those moments of how we act after a disaster, really turn that into what our everyday behavior looks like.
Well, just shortly, I think it makes for a nice trajectory to have started this asking if de Blasio is a progressive, and we end up asking what is progressiveness today, right? I think we are all under the impression that the answer to that question is not very fulfilling. And in terms of the horizon that you're trying to devise, and the horizon is rather bleak, that we see that we live at a moment in history where the forces of capitalism are dominating every corner of life, and up to except for the idea of the world revolution in the Western world, to be a progressive was basically, the social democratic agenda was to give more power to the state as a player, that as an equalizer of all these social differences, and I think that's still true in a very diminished fashion. That it was probably 50 years ago when all these things happened that you described. And I think that the biggest challenge that de Blasio will have to address, or any leader that has purposes to be or wants to be a progressive leader in this country or this moment in history, is how to deal with these forces that are basically unbeatable, and how to negotiate if affordable housing is just wrangling an agreement with the big real estate interests to have what is equivalent to 2% of the whole units in New York. Is that a measure of progressive? I personally feel that's very unfulfilling, but it's probably the best that he can get at this point. And I think that for the future, as long as we keep seeing, it's funny that in the Cold War, people were afraid of the Russian coming to this country. And Russians are coming now to this country. And they're coming with millions of dollars, and they're buying
They're here.
all this huge, real estate property that making the prices of real estate go up and up in this city. And how do you stop that? You cannot stop that, apparently. But those are the forces that are leading this gentrification that you see, that are changing the nature of this city. It was always a city of different people of different incomes, and now it's increasingly difficult, almost impossible for more and more people to live in the city. And that is the big change and the big, challenge that is affecting us all. And we'll see. I hope that de Blasio can make a dent in that story.
So let's just remember that cities are humanity's greatest creation, maybe our most important creation. And we're all engaged in this together as urbanists and as people who live here. And I appreciate your kind attention. Would you help me in thanking our panelists?